This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I have with us the one, the only Pat Schaeffer. Pat's been on this podcast with us a few times before, and she has talked about her model, which I'm really excited about, because I think we get to talk a little bit about flies in the pharma industry, which has some, shall we say, unique situations they have to deal with. But before we get started, Pat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Pat Schaeffer. I am of HR background, human resources background. I'm a lifelong networker, and that led me to, and also a leadership development professional. And when those two came together, it was an aha moment. Teaching leaders to be more collaborative and much better networkers, and then encouraging their people to do that. So that's what, I've been focusing my practice on for, the last 10 years or so. The practice is called silo busting networking. And to your point, the model works both ways. It works internally within an organization, and it works externally. And I know you're a big networker too, and we focus a lot on our external networks. But when I'm talking to companies, I'm talking with them about how they help people develop those important internal networks that help them get things done more efficiently.
Which I think is kind of important. I think the idea of leadership. Do you find that leaders, when you're talking about silo busting networking, if you will, they're more internal focused or external focused? I guess, what is leadership? Is it about managing your internal teams, or is it about managing your external teams?
I think they're mostly focused on managing their internal teams. I think where a lot of them miss the boat, though, is that they're focused on their team. So they're focused in their silo versus focused on establishing relationships with their peers across the organization and encouraging their people to do the same thing, so that everybody has a broader focus on what the organization's trying to achieve and how they can contribute to that. So it takes those blinders off, if you will. And that's where I think leadership tends to fall down. And I'm not impugning the leaders about that. It's just part of most organization cultures that you focus on your functional area or your functional silo. Might be a business unit, but you don't function across the company. You don't function as a leader of the organization versus the leader of a particular business unit or function.
So we're talking about, literally, as you put it, silo busting, bursting out of your silo, seeing past past what you've been assigned to look at because of the larger value across the organization. I guess my question for you then is, as you've done this, you've talked about this model, the 2 C's and a P. And can you talk a little bit about how that model works and how it all comes together here?
Yeah, sure. The model is a good internal networker or an external networker share the same model. They are curious. They want to know what's going on in other parts of the organization, or they want to know what's going on with the person that they're meeting and networking with. They ask lots of questions. They ask questions about the organization, and leaders need to teach them how to ask really good questions and how to channel those questions in the right way. So that's the curious part of it, the curiosity part. The next part is connection. So they use their curiosity to help them make solid connections and build relationships with people within their own silo, but even more importantly, outside their silo. And understanding, what is it that you do versus what I do, and how do those fit together? And are there ways we're stepping on each other's toes, and are there ways that we could work together better to work more effectively individually, but to work more effectively as a team and as an organization? And then the final one, purposeful, is probably the most important because it's all about intention. Networking takes a lot of time. I don't want to network just for the sake of networking. I want to network with a purpose, with a strategy in mind, with an intent in mind, and reach out and develop relationships with people that are going to be meaningful. And by meaningful, I mean they're going to help me be more effective in my work, and it's going to help them be more effective. And most importantly, it's going to help the organization be more effective. So it's a real focus on performance of the organization and how everybody contributes to that, and everybody understanding that and being mindful of it.
I think the mindfulness, as you said, is possibly the most important one. And when we talk about it, one of the things that comes out to me that sort of strikes me is this idea. It's at the end of the year. We're all doing our year-end planning right now. And it strikes me that I'm spending a lot of time right now being more mindful about what I want to spend my energy on in 2023, which means that I have to, as you put it, be purposeful. Is it possible to be purposeful about networking, which is generally thought of as inherently, what's the word I'm looking for? Serendipitous.
Right.
This idea that you don't plan who you meet.
Yeah. It's definitely important in networking. If you take a serendipitous approach to networking, whether it's networking internally or externally, you'll spend a lot of time, you'll meet a lot of people, but you won't build relationships. And the key thing to any effect, to getting the return on your investment in networking, is to build relationships that are going to pay off and be win-win. So they're going to pay off for you and they're going to pay off for the other person. And that's where the mindfulness, the purpose, the intention comes into it. That you want to seek out people with whom you're going to form a long-term relationship that's going to benefit both of you. The old external networking thing of, exchanging business cards around the table, speed dating kind of thing, it doesn't really net you anything. It might feel good. You might have a fun time doing it. But when you look back on it, you say, oh, well, that was an hour of fun, but it didn't really help me at all. Didn't help me personally, didn't help me professionally. So it's that, going into networking with the idea of building relationships, that's absolutely key.
Which really ties into this idea. So you have a purpose. Let me start with that first question. How do you identify the most important purpose? Is it this year I'm making this up. I am a leader in a sales organization. I want to increase sales by 25% because I'm ambitious. That's my goal. So that is the purpose, or is there a different purpose from a networking standpoint?
That's really that's a high level purpose, but then you kind of need to dig down into that. So how am I going to do that? And whose help do I need in doing that? What do I need from them in order to do that? What do I need to provide to them in order for them to do it? So that's where the purpose in networking comes into it. I can't, I got to do this with my peers in marketing. So I need to have good relationships with my peers in marketing. It's that kind of thoughtfulness and that kind of purpose that really drills down from that sort of, the balcony that you're on when you decide, what are my goals this year? What are my key goals? How am I going to get there? And that's where the purpose of the collaboration, the communication, the helping across boundaries really comes into it.
Which really raises that that question of boundaries, right? You talked about if I'm in charge of sales and I want to increase sales by 25%, I need to work with marketing. A underutilized resource in the pharma world is the medical affairs group. The medical affairs group generally is they're having the same conversations you would love to have if you're in sales with doctors. However, there are all these limits that legal, compliance, and regulatory have placed where you cannot have the same conversations you want to have.
Yeah.
how do you recommend balancing the needs of a sales group trying to advance sales versus the needs of medical affairs, who effectively has a Chinese wall between between the sales function and the educational function or the scientific function?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the medical affairs team they've been put in a real tough situation because they're expected to be the bridge to the commercial side, between the development side and the commercial side. And yet there's so much that they're not allowed to say and talk about, right? So regulatory compliance has really put them in quite the box. So they need to be very careful. They need to draw that line.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, the they, is that medical affairs or
medical affairs? Yeah, medical affairs really needs to understand that line. And there's a really good article. It's a blog, actually, and you can share this with your viewers and your listeners at some point, about the medical affairs do's and don'ts. And what it really boils down to is, if you're in medical affairs, and especially, the spotlight really goes on to the medical science liaisons, because they're kind of out there in the same market as the salespeople are, and they're responsible for educating salespeople. They need to be really careful that what they're communicating to the salespeople internally is really what this drug is all about on prescription, what it's been approved for, what its approved use is. They know a lot about the off-label kind of uses as well, and they can't go there. They can't talk about that with the sales and marketing side. What they need to focus on is, here's what this drug has been approved for. Let us help you market it. Let us have conversations about how you market it for that purpose. Now, from an external standpoint, they're calling on the same people. So the MSLs, the medical science liaisons, and the salespeople, they're calling on the same healthcare providers.
They are.
They have to be careful not to do that at the same time. They can't really be in the same meetings with these people. There are some exceptions, and these are good networking. This is a good networking thing. One of the things about networking and in the connecting part of networking is making introductions to people who can benefit by knowing other people. So they could come together and they could introduce each other to a particular healthcare provider. But if in that meeting, if the conversation starts to stray to the commercial use of the product, the MSL needs to get the heck out of there, because that right there, that's where their bind is, and they can get caught up pretty easily in a discussion where it's really not ethical for them to be taking part in it. And the same is true on the sales side. If the MSL is going to have a conversation with the healthcare provider about off-label use, salesperson can't be in the room either. So that interaction with the same healthcare provider can only really be at a superficial level. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think I can speak a little bit about it from a legal compliance standpoint. The key is, you're not supposed to have this 1-2 punch, if you will, for lack of a better term. You can't have medical affairs sow in the seeds and send sales in to sort of reap the crop, right? Because that would be deemed to be duplicitous, for lack of a better term. Now, there's a whole bunch of legal arguments as to whether that would survive legal challenges and blah, blah, blah. But overall, the idea is that that's where we are as to how compliance functions are right now functioning. The big question I have from this is, there is a disparity of information. There is a disparity of knowledge about the drug between sales and medical affairs. Medical affairs typically is staffed by your scientists, if you will, whether it's the PharmDs, the MDs, the PhDs. While the salespeople are educated in the drug, they may not have the same level of knowledge as the MDs, PharmDs, PhDs. How do you set up the salespeople are curious. So how do you advise a MSL to have those conversations with sales so that they're answering questions, because ideally your salesperson is curious, but at the same time drawing the balances to, look, I can't tell you some of this information because that can come back to bite all of us.
Right, right. So the education piece of I think there are two parts to this. One is education of the sales force. And that education has to be around the approved use of the drug, period, the end. It cannot stray into other areas. They've really got to keep themselves in the box on that. The other thing that they can do is work with marketing around the messages. Again, the messages have to be focused on the approved use of the drug, but ways of that the sales and the marketing people can begin to educate healthcare providers and change up those messages. Because one of the complaints from healthcare providers is they just get the same messages warmed over, right? So what the medical affairs folks can do is continually look for those nuances and help craft different messages to help healthcare providers understand even better how to prescribe, how to use these drugs. Strictly, though, on the approved uses for it.
Approved indication. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that raises the question, can the knowledge go the other way? And I think that's kind of important, and that's kind of interesting. People always focus on this idea that medical affairs is the keeper of scientific information. And I've always thought that that's great, and that's true in many ways. But sales is the keeper of engagement in a way that medical affairs simply were not trained to do. Salespeople, day in and day out, their goal is to build these connections, and they're building these connections at a human level, not a scientific level. And I feel like there is this one-to-one connection that salespeople can teach medical affairs people. It's not an education I've ever seen happen. But could you talk a little bit about the transfer of bilateral knowledge when both sides are not communicating the value add each of them has, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I think I understand what you're asking. I think there's probably less restriction on the salespeople. So the salespeople they're out, and I think this is where the point you're driving at. They're out there, they're learning things from healthcare providers. They're getting questions. A healthcare provider might say, well, I have this patient that I think might be a candidate for this, but it wouldn't be. They don't fit all the they don't have all the symptoms for the approved use. Do you think there's an opportunity for them? Well, the salesperson can't cross that line and talk about that. They don't have that kind of knowledge, but they can take that knowledge back to medical affairs. Medical affairs can have the conversation with the healthcare provider and work it, from the scientific angle. So I guess what I'm saying is they can be a conduit, that salespeople can be a conduit of information back to medical affairs from the healthcare provider. They can't be, giving them any information about off-label use or anything like that. And they really shouldn't have that information, right? But when it comes to going back the other way, it's not going to go through the salesperson. It's going to go directly from medical affairs to the healthcare provider who was asking the questions.
Yes, and typically that's done, as you may know, through what's called the MRF, which is I have a medical information request form, and that question would go. What I was asking is a slightly different version of the question. Okay. I'm obviously not phrasing it properly. I apologize for that. The question I'm asking is, can sales teach sales to medical affairs, not for the purpose of selling, but for the purpose of how do you build a more human bond?
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the key things around internal networking. When you have people who are really good at internal networking, you can turn them into ambassadors. They can teach other people, other salespeople, how to do the networking and do it in a way that shows the results that they've achieved. Because salespeople are, they're driven by the end result, right? So I don't want to just talk to them about what a great time I had, talking to this person. I want to say what came out of that conversation. So absolutely, salespeople can train other salespeople to be better at networking, educating them about what medical affairs is. And this is, kind of cross-pollination, that a good way of networking, and I think you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a compliant way of networking is medical affairs can talk to the commercial side about what it is they do,
Right.
and vice versa, so that
Correct.
they know, and so that they know where, kind of where their swim lanes are and where their wheelhouses are. And that kind of information can be passed back and forth. It can be passed through the sales organization, through marketing, from one person to another in that part of the organization. And the more of that kind of collaboration and communication goes on, the better, I think.
I think so too. And that's why it's the point I wanted to make, which was, yes, you talked about training within the sales force. I achieved a 40% sales growth compared to person X who achieved 15%. I can train you. But I wonder if there needs to be a conversation about, I achieved a 40% sales growth, but maybe I can train you, medical affairs, medical science liaison, to achieve better connections with your doctors. We aren't going to look at the impact on sales, but it will teach you how I was able to build a connection that helps me with sales, but it may help you with building a better connection with the doctors you're calling on.
I see what you're saying. Yes. So that they can actually train them to be better at that relationship building piece, which is what they're really good at. Right.
Exactly.
And this is, kind of a generalization, but people on the scientific side, the engineering side, they tend not to be as outgoing and as extroverted and not as good at building those relationships. And I would even think, making the introductions is important.
Yeah.
But also then here's what I know about this person from a personality standpoint.
Right.
This healthcare provider is very curious.
Right.
And is constantly asking really, really good questions. So you need to be prepared for that. But they're also a very warm and friendly person. So you don't want to come across cold with them. You want to come across friendly and warm. So they can give them that kind of information that they've picked up as they've built the relationships with those people. And that's really what they're good at. And I think that's the point you were driving home, that they're really, they're good at building those relationships.
So can you talk a little bit about, these are kinds of things that are very touchy-feely. They're very fuzzy. Do you put this stuff into a CRM, or is this more, it requires that one-on-one connection that you're building across teams? How do you communicate this information? Because there's so many people.
Yeah, some of it's hard to put into a CRM. But you can put personality traits and kind of, here's the outcome of the conversation I had with them. And I think it's because I did X, Y, and Z. But I think you can't underestimate the personal touch, just communicating person to person, this kind of information. But yeah, I would think as much as you can capture in writing, if it's not just a sense that you have about the person or a feeling, but something that you can actually talk about because it came out in the conversation, I think that should go in the CRM so that it's there for everybody to see, and not just the people that you are interacting with.
So if you went into one of these organizations and you were going to train this cross-team, cross-silo communication, where would you start?
Well, actually, I would start with the leadership. Because you got to have a culture that encourages this kind of collaboration and communication. If the culture doesn't support it, people aren't going to do it because they will feel like it's the wrong thing to do. People are going to follow the culture and the behaviors that are acceptable in the culture. Leaders set that culture. They set the tone. So, and they do this by demonstrating. So they've got to be talking with the people in medical affairs and sharing the right information with the people in medical affairs and teaching their people how to do that as well. They've got to model it. So I would start with the leadership, and help them understand, what networking is all about, and then how you do it in this highly regulated environment. when you're crossing that boundary from the commercial to the development side of the house. And then
I love it. Mm-hmm.
And then you can, when you get them bought into it and they're actually.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I have with us the one, the only Pat Schaeffer. Pat's been on this podcast with us a few times before, and she has talked about her model, which I'm really excited about, because I think we get to talk a little bit about flies in the pharma industry, which has some, shall we say, unique situations they have to deal with. But before we get started, Pat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Pat Schaeffer. I am of HR background, human resources background. I'm a lifelong networker, and that led me to, and also a leadership development professional. And when those two came together, it was an aha moment. Teaching leaders to be more collaborative and much better networkers, and then encouraging their people to do that. So that's what, I've been focusing my practice on for, the last 10 years or so. The practice is called silo busting networking. And to your point, the model works both ways. It works internally within an organization, and it works externally. And I know you're a big networker too, and we focus a lot on our external networks. But when I'm talking to companies, I'm talking with them about how they help people develop those important internal networks that help them get things done more efficiently.
Which I think is kind of important. I think the idea of leadership. Do you find that leaders, when you're talking about silo busting networking, if you will, they're more internal focused or external focused? I guess, what is leadership? Is it about managing your internal teams, or is it about managing your external teams?
I think they're mostly focused on managing their internal teams. I think
These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not